we can get all started. Hello, defense counsel. All right, we're going to be calling the case of United States versus Kara Bassett to order. My name is Judge DeCamp. Scoring judges, look to the two buttons on the lower left of your screen. If you haven't already, please turn off audio and video. These should stay off until the trial ends and we give feedback afterwards. Also, please have your video set to hide all non-video participants. What that means is that the only people that you should be seeing on screen right now are me and the two advocates. And one other thing is, if it looks like I'm looking up, I have a dual screen set up and all the text is above, so I'm not looking at you. Just a weird situation. Thank you for your understanding. And with that, can the advocates please state appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. My name is Regina Campbell, and I'm representing the United States government. I'm joined in trial today by my co-counsel, Henry Hopcraft.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to both of you. Good afternoon. Defense?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Harsha Sridhar. I'm here today on behalf of Kara Bassett.
Good afternoon. All right. And we'll now hear opening statements from each party, unless there are any housekeeping matters you'd like to address first.
None from the prosecution, Your Honor.
Sure. Defense?
Your Honor, I just want to invoke Rules 603 and 615 for the constructive pre-swearing and sequestration of all witnesses.
Government, do you have any issue with that?
None, Your Honor.
All right, and then they're both invoked. Sure.
Your Honor, I just want to draw the court's attention to two of the pretrial orders. Okay. Specifically, pretrial order 7, which says exhibits 4 to 33 are pre-admitted. So we'll be referring to those without further foundation, displaying them for the jury. And also number 9, under these unusual circumstances, Ms. Bassett isn't, of course, alongside me today, but she'll constructively be at counsel table.
Very good. Thank you.
That's
right.
With
that, we're ready, Your Honor.
Great. All right. Then before we hear opening statements, everyone make sure they're in speaker view. If you aren't, that button is in the upper right of your screen. And attorneys, if you'd be so kind as to mute your audio when your opposing counsel is speaking. All right. With that,
may I proceed?
You may. Thank you.
May it please the court, opposing counsel, ladies and gentlemen. In order to take what he had, she had to take his life. Members of the jury, this is Don Clark. He's a father of 2, an animal lover, and a business owner right here in Florida. But today you're going to learn that in August of 2017, Mr. Clark suddenly went missing. For most of his community, this was a huge loss. His employees lost their boss, his children lost their father. But what you're going to learn in trial today is that one person gained from Mr. Clark's disappearance. One person got $2 million. One person got a zoo. One person got everything Mr. Clark had. And that one person was his wife, Kara Bassett, the defendant. You're also going to learn that in order for the defendant to get or to take what Mr. Clark had, she had to take his life. Now, in order to understand why, I have to take you back to 2011. And this whole case sort of started like a normal love story. The defendant and Mr. Clark, they met, they fell in love, they got married, and at first they were a pretty happy couple. But you're going to learn that a couple of years into the marriage, they started to have issues. You see, the defendant and her husband, they own this elephant zoo. And you're going to learn that the defendant didn't like the way the zoo was being ran. The defendant wanted to run this zoo herself, but her husband said no. The defendant wanted to turn the zoo into an animal sanctuary, but the defendant said the zoo was his. And so today you're going to learn that she couldn't just ask to have that zoo. The defendant had to take it. In June of 2017, you're going to learn that the defendant and her husband signed a document a document that said that the defendant could have everything everything her husband had, including the zoo, as long as he went missing. You're going to learn that 2 months later, August 18th, 2017, the defendant made certain that her husband went missing. You're going to hear that she took one of the elephant tranquilizers, the one you see on your screen here, and stuck it in her husband's side. You're going to hear that she put his dead and limp body into the back of a car. You're going to hear that she threw his dead body into the bottom of a swamp, the swamp you see on your screen here. And you're going to hear that she left him there to die. It is for these reasons that as the government in today's trial, we are bringing a charge against the defendant for murder. And that means we're going to prove to you beyond all reasonable doubt 2 things. First, we're going to show you that the defendant killed her husband. And second, we're going to show you that the defendant intended to kill her husband. Now, in order to meet our burden, we're going to call an FBI agent, Special Agent Steph Johnson. Ms. Johnson was the lead investigator into the death of Mr. Clark. And Ms. Johnson's going to walk through her investigation, and she's going to tell you about 3 key pieces of information that led her to arrest the defendant. The defendant's suspicious behavior around the time of the murder, the physical evidence that pointed to the defendant, and the defendant's motive. So let's take those one at a time. Start with the physical evidence that tied to the defendant. Ms. Johnson's going to take that stand, and she's going to tell you that she found algae on the defendant's boots that matched the swamp where the victim was last seen. 2, you're going to hear about the suspicious actions of the defendant. Ms. Johnson's going to get on the stand, and she's going to tell you that normally when people go missing, well, their loved ones are worried. Their loved ones call the police. The defendant didn't do any of that. Instead, the defendant was suspicious. She didn't call the police, didn't call to try to find her husband, didn't call anyone. In fact, you're going to hear that she didn't even call the police until a week after her husband had been missing. 3, Ms. Johnson's going to tell you about the defendant's motive. You remember that document I told you that the defendant and her husband signed back in June 2017? Well, you're actually going to get a chance to look at that document. And it's going to say that in order for the defendant to get or to take what her husband had, she had to make sure he disappeared. In order to take what her husband had, she had to take his life. Now, the defendant thought that she could kill her husband, throw him into a swamp like he was a piece of trash, take all of his property, and just walk away. But she can't walk away from the facts. Facts, members of the jury, they're stubborn things. They can't be changed. They can't be avoided. And there's one fact in this case that is so stubborn that nothing that defense counsel can tell you will change it. In order to take what her husband had, the defendant had to take his life. That's why we're all here today. That's why Don Clark isn't. And that's why at the end of today's trial, I'm going to stand before you and ask you to find the defendant guilty for the murder of her husband. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Defense, opening statement. It looks like you're still muted for me. Okay, there we go.
Am I on? Can you hear me, Your Honor?
I can, thank you.
May I proceed?
You may.
Members of the jury, look a little closer. Now, it's very easy to understand why Miss Campbell just told that story. A story about a woman who would take her husband's life just to get what he had. Because when something terrible happens, when someone disappears, well, it's easy to look at the first scapegoat you find, to assume the worst, to fill in the gaps with whatever you need to fit your story, and ignore the rest. But today we're going to ask you to look a little closer at the government's case, and we're going to show you that things aren't quite as clear as Miss Campbell wants them to be. You see, on August 25th, 2017, FBI agents arrived at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park to investigate the disappearance of a man named Don Clark. And when they got there, they found Don Clark's wife, a woman named Cara Bassett. Members of the jury, for the next year, they did nothing but assume the worst of Miss Bassett. That's how she ended up being charged with murder. But members of the jury, what the FBI failed to do, you're going to learn today, is they failed to look a little closer. And the FBI failed to look a little closer at Cara Bassett's relationship with her husband, a relationship that you're going to hear today was a loving, normal one. Not perfect, but not homicidal. Members of the jury, the police failed to look a little closer at an alternative suspect. Someone with something to hide. Someone who didn't want to talk to the police. A suspect the FBI didn't bother pursuing. You're going to learn that the evidence the government has, it doesn't tie Miss Bassett to this crime. That's what happens when you don't look a little closer. But members of the jury, just because the FBI didn't look closely enough during their investigation, it doesn't mean the United States Attorney's Office can get away with the same today. Because now they're in a courtroom. They have a burden of proof. And for them to meet that burden, they need to show you that Miss Bassett intentionally killed her husband. They need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the highest legal burden in our justice system. And it means at the end of this trial, if you have any unanswered questions, any lingering doubts about what happened to Don Clark, you have to find Miss Bassett not guilty. And today, if you look a little closer, you're going to see plenty of reasons to doubt the government's story. Today, the government's going to try to present evidence that implicates Miss Bassett in the disappearance of her husband. And the way Miss Campbell just described it, you'd think that evidence is a smoking gun. She said facts are a stubborn thing. You'd think these facts are persistent, that they're incontrovertible. But you're going to learn that no matter how hard they try, the FBI can't place Cara Bassett at the scene of the crime the day it happened. In fact, you're going to learn that they can't place her with a murder weapon at all, with her husband's body at all, with the date of death at all, because 3 years later, they still don't know that information. As the defense, we don't have a burden of proof. We don't have to marshal evidence, call witnesses, but we will. We will say you can see the holes in the government's story. Today, you're going to meet a woman named Jo Kwong. She's a producer who has known Miss Bassett for years, making a documentary about her elephant sanctuary. When Miss Kwong takes a stand, you're going to be able to look a little closer at Don Clark's relationship with two people, Miss Bassett and a woman who Miss Campbell didn't mention in her opening statement, Mr. Clark's ex-wife, Lisa. You're going to learn that Mr. Clark and his ex-wife, they had a difficult relationship, one in which Miss Clark would do something that Miss Bassett never did. She would threaten Don Clark. Ms. Kwong is going to tell you about text messages and phone calls between Mr. Clark and his ex-wife the day Mr. Clark disappeared. You're going to learn that the FBI never followed up on those calls, never considered any other suspects. Members of the jury, you're going to learn that when Lisa Clark refused to be interviewed by the FBI, well, they gave up. They refused to look a little closer. At the end of today's trial, it's going to be clear that the government rushed to judgment. They looked at the first person they saw and they stopped right there. Your job is the opposite. Your job today is to ask questions, to be skeptical of the government's case, and to look for actual evidence that proves to you what they're claiming. And when you do that, when you look a little closer at what actually happened in August of 2017, you're going to see the truth. That's why at the end of this trial, I'm going to ask you to find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Before we move into the first witness, I'm going to ask everyone to switch, please, to gallery view. That button is in the upper right of your screen, and that allows you to see the attorneys and witnesses at the same time. Okay, cool. Now then, would the government like to call its first witness, or are there any matters we need to discuss before we do that?
No matters, Your Honor. We're prepared to call our first witness.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Your Honor, at this time, the government calls Steph Johnson to the stand. May I proceed?
You may.
Good afternoon, Ms. Johnson. Could you please introduce yourself to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Steph Johnson.
Are you employed, ma'am?
I am. I'm a special agent with the FBI. I have been for a number of years now, working specifically on violent crimes.
Could you talk to us a little bit about how you became a special agent?
Sure. Believe it or not, it's actually a family business. My dad was an FBI agent here in Texas a number of years ago, and I followed suit.
All right, Special Agent Johnson. I want to talk about your involvement in today's case, all right? How are you involved in this case?
Well, I was the lead investigator into the case of the disappearance of Mr. Don Clark back in 2017.
I want you to walk the members of the jury through that investigation. Can you tell us how it began?
Of course. We were initially contacted by Miss Bassett, Mr. Clark's wife. At that point, we just believed Mr. Clark was missing, so we started looking for any trace of where he might be, his last known location.
You say you looked for his last known location. Were you able to figure out what that location was?
Well, Miss Bassett let us know that she had found a car that they owned at a nearby airport. So that's where we went first.
Did you find the car at the airport?
We did. There was a van that the couple owned at that airport, the Caribel-Leon Airport, very near their home and the Elephant Park where they lived.
Okay, so Don Clark's car is at an airport. Did you find any evidence that Don Clark got on a plane?
We didn't, ma'am. We didn't find plane records or anything like that suggesting that Mr. Clark was actually on a plane. We knew that he owned a plane, but the plane that he owned was actually at the airport where we went.
Okay, well, if there was no evidence that he got on a plane, were you able to determine how his car got to an airport?
Yes, ma'am. We were actually able to extract GPS information from that van at the airport. We were able to determine where the van went. It went from the home, the Clark's residence, to a swamp about 100 miles away, and then to that airport.
So you say the car went from his home to a swamp. Ma'am,
Yes, ma'am.
How far was that swamp from Mr. Clark's home?
It was more than 100 miles away, ma'am.
During the course of your investigation, were you able to find out why he was at a swamp 100 miles away from his house?
We weren't sure at first. There was nothing that made sense to us about why he might have gone to that swamp. So we ended up speaking to his wife, Miss Bassett, about that.
And do you remember what Miss Bassett told you about what happened to her husband?
Well, she told us she didn't know what happened. She said she woke up on August 19th and realized her husband was missing and she wasn't sure where he was.
Well, ma'am, after you spoke to the defendant, Miss Bassett, did you continue to perform your investigation?
Yes, ma'am, of course.
Ma'am, in the course of your investigation, did you find any evidence that corroborated the defendant's story?
We found some evidence that corroborated the story and some inconsistencies. There were two inconsistencies in particular.
What were those two inconsistencies?
Well, first, we found physical evidence that didn't support what the defendant, Miss Bassett, had told us, and also her behavior after she told us her husband went missing was suspicious as part of our investigation.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion, specifically to the witness's characterization of Miss Bassett's behavior.
Okay.
May I respond?
Please.
Your Honor, we've already established that this witness is a special agent with the FBI, and she has been a special agent for a number of years working in the Criminal Investigations Division. At this point, we've laid enough foundation for her to be able to tell which suspects are acting suspicious and what suspects are acting normal. So this is a proper opinion.
Defense, is your issue with the characterization of suspicious?
Yes, Your Honor. Specifically, we don't have any reason to believe that this agent has interacted with Miss Bassett outside of the course of this investigation. She has no way of knowing what Miss Bassett's normal behavior is. And so to come to this characterization that Miss Bassett is acting suspiciously, that both lacks facts and data backup and also the necessary
That you explore on cross-examination. For now, it's overruled. Thank you.
So, Detective, you were just telling us about two things that were inconsistent in the defendant's story.
Yes, ma'am.
What were those two things?
Again, it was the physical evidence that we found over the course of our investigation, as well as the defendant's behavior after she told us her husband went missing.
Well, Detective, let's take a closer look at those two inconsistencies in the defendant's story. Starting with the physical evidence. What about the physical evidence contradicted the defendant's story?
Well, we actually found mud inside the swamp, of course, and we found similar mud on the defendant's work boots, on Miss Bassett's work boots. So we had our forensic team compare those samples, mud from the swamp and mud from the boots. And we found that there were two types of algae found both at the swamp and also on also on Miss Bassett's boots. That led us to believe she had in fact been to the Big Gum Swamp and wasn't home all night like she claimed.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion under Rule 702B. May I be heard?
Please.
Your Honor, this witness has just reached the conclusion that because some algae on Miss Bassett's boots matched the algae in the swamp, she's come to two conclusions. First, that swamp was where the algae came from, and second, that it contradicts Miss Bassett's belief or Miss Bassett's claim that she was out all night. We haven't heard any foundation that algae only lasts for a day or two, that would in fact contradict that part of Miss Bassett's claims. And also, we haven't heard any foundation that the swamp is the only place we'd see that combination of algae. We just haven't heard the facts and data for this witness to render her specific conclusions.
Your Honor, may I respond to that?
You may.
Well, first of all, the witness didn't actually say that the algae did match the mud at the swamp. She said it was just a match to the boot. So she said the algae at the swamp matched the boot. She wasn't saying that, oh, it must have been from the swamp. She was just saying that that's what their investigation indicated to her. And if I can be clear, Your Honor, there's a distinction between the detective saying, we know for certain that this algae came from this swamp and the defendant was there, and her saying, based on this evidence, we were led to believe that this thing happened. So at this point, she's not giving an improper opinion. She's talking about what she found in her investigation and what that investigation led the FBI to believe about this case.
Okay, defense, it sounds like what she's saying is that it's a bit narrower than what you were asserting. Do you still have a problem?
Yes, Your Honor, particularly with the testimony that the presence of this algae contradicted Miss Bassett's story. If this witness wants to say that based on forensic techniques, algae on two different surfaces match, we agree that that's well within the scope of her expertise. But it's really when she goes into that next step of saying that because the algae matches, that is somehow a contradiction to Miss Bassett's claims, that's where she goes past her expertise. And that's where she just doesn't have the facts and data to render that conclusion.
I'll give the government a very brief response.
Yes, Your Honor. Again, the witness is well within her right to testify about what the information she gathered is and how that information impacted her investigation. At this point, that is exactly what she's doing. She's saying we found this evidence and it led us to believe there was a contradiction in the defendant's testimony. That is her expert opinion.
Thank you to both sides. Very well argued. Defense, take it up on cross if you'd like. It's overruled.
Ma'am, you were just telling us that you found you found mud on the defendant's boots and you found mud at the swamp, and that information seemed to match. Well, what did that lead you and the FBI to believe?
Well, that's exactly right. Miss Bassett told us she stayed home all night. She told us she had never been to the Big Gum Swamp. So when we found matching algae from the swamp and on her boots, that led us to believe that she hadn't been totally honest with us when she said those things.
You said there was a second thing that led you to doubt the defendant's story. You said it was her behavior.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, sure. You know, I've worked many cases like this, kidnappings, that sort of thing, where someone goes missing. And generally, the family members are very concerned with trying to figure out where that person is. They text, they call. In this case, Miss Bassett never texted her husband. She didn't call her husband for an entire week after she told us he went missing.
Ma'am, you said she didn't text or call her husband for an entire week. Did she actually text or call her husband at all when he went missing?
No, ma'am. We reviewed her phone records and she never did after August 18th, the day he went missing.
What about the police, detective? Did the defendant ever contact the police and say her husband was missing?
She did contact the police, but not on August 19th when she told us she first realized her husband was missing. It was actually about a week later when she called the police.
All right, detective. After finding these inconsistencies in the defendant's story, how did you proceed with your investigation?
At this point, we began to suspect foul play. We were looking into the defendant specifically.
What do you mean? What did you believe that the defendant might have done?
We suspected that it was possible the defendant had killed Mr. Clark.
Well, if the defendant had killed her husband, did you find any evidence that she had a way to do it?
We did. So we actually found this chemical on the elephant park where Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark both lived. It's a chemical used as an elephant tranquilizer.
And why was that elephant tranquilizer important to your case, or excuse me, to your investigation?
Well, for two reasons. First of all, it's a very dangerous, potent chemical. It's used to sedate elephants, so large creatures, of course. So for a human, just a drop or 2 drops can be absolutely lethal. The second reason was that we realized one of the syringes, one container of that chemical was missing.
Ma'am, you said that one of those syringes with that deadly chemical in it was missing. Did the defendant have access to those deadly chemicals around the time that her husband died, based on your investigation?
Yes, ma'am. She told me herself. She told me that those chemicals were stored in a particular place in a shed on the property, that only a few people had keys to that shed, and she was one of the 4 people.
Ma'am, after you found that she had these, or that the syringe was missing, were you able to determine if the defendant had a motive to hurt her husband?
Well, we started looking into that, and we found a document that stood out to us. It was a power of attorney document. It had been signed by both Mr. Clark and Miss Bassett.
Let's actually take a look at that document.
Absolutely.
Ma'am, what does this power of attorney document say? Can you give us a summary?
Sure. Generally speaking, a power of attorney document that somebody signs in the case that something were to happen to them. They pass on who would have control over their estate, their businesses, that sort of thing.
And so according to this document that the defendant and her husband signed, what would happen?
Well,
what would happen if her husband were to disappear?
Oh, of course. Well, this document actually specified if Mr. Clark were to disappear, then Miss Bassett would gain control over everything, the entire estate that Mr. Clark owned, all his businesses and properties.
Ma'am, you say this document tells us that Miss Bassett could have gotten all of her husband's properties and estates if you disappeared. After August 18th, 2017, did the defendant recover anything from this document?
Well, yes, ma'am. She did utilize power of attorney.
What did she do?
Among a number of things, she turned that elephant park that they lived in to an elephant sanctuary, sort of like turning a zoo into more of a sanctuary, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Detective.
Thank you. Defense, cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, may I proceed?
Please, go ahead.
Agent Johnson, I want to start by talking about the GPS data from Mr. Clark's van.
Good afternoon, sir, of course.
And you'd recognize a summary of that data if I showed it to you. Good afternoon, ma'am.
I'm sure I would.
Mr. Ghanem, can we go ahead and put it up? This right here is the GPS data, isn't it, ma'am?
That's right.
Agent Johnson, that data tells us that someone drove that van from the Elephant Park to Big Gum Swamp August 18th, right?
That's exactly right, sir.
It tells us the van was stopped for 44 minutes.
Yes, that's right.
And then it tells us that someone drove that van from the swamp to a private airport.
Yes, sir. 132 miles away.
That GPS data doesn't tell us who is driving the van.
You're right, sir. We can't discern that information from the GPS data itself.
Certainly doesn't tell us if the person who drove the van to the swamp is the same person who drove the van to the airport.
No, sir. Again, it doesn't tell us who was driving the vehicle.
Now, you believe that Miss Bassett was the one driving the van, right?
Yes, sir.
You actually pulled up her cell phone data.
Yes, sir. I did review her phone records as part of my work in this case.
And you've looked at data for all the cell towers around Big Gum Swamp, right?
That's true.
And what the data tells you is that Miss Bassett's phone was never connected to any of the cell towers around that swamp.
That's true, sir. We know her phone was never near any of those cell towers at the swamp.
So the GPS data doesn't connect Miss Bassett to the swamp, right?
Again, sir, the GPS data, it doesn't specify, it can't specify who was driving the car.
And the cell data, that doesn't connect Miss Bassett to the swamp.
You're right, sir.
And then I want to talk about the data that you said is connected to Miss Bassett, this forensic evidence. You said that there was algae in the mud on Miss Bassett's boots, right?
Yes, sir.
You said that algae matches the algae in the van.
Yes, sir, that's true. The algae matched, the mud samples that we found algae matched the boots, the swamp, as well as the gas pedal of the van.
That's right. So you said the algae matches the van, the boot, and the swamp.
You're exactly right, sir.
And you actually spoke to Miss Bassett, right?
Yes, a number of times over the course of several years.
And you actually asked Miss Bassett where the mud on her boots came from.
It actually was a special agent I was working with, but you're right, sir, I was there for that conversation.
When that special agent asked Miss Bassett where the mud came from, she said it probably came from working on the dirt at the Elephant Park.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay to the statements of Cara Bassett.
Response.
Your Honor, we're using the statement not to prove the truth of the matter asserted, but to show an effect on listener or lack thereof. Specifically, that upon hearing Miss Bassett's explanation, the FBI took no effort to actually investigate that to see whether it's true. That goes to the credibility of the investigation. Now, if Miss Campbell wants a limiting instruction to that effect, I'd be fine with that.
Are you telling me? Go ahead, Ms. Campbell. Go ahead.
Well, Your Honor, it actually appears that the defense is using these statements for the truth of the matter asserted. In their opening statement, it appeared that their theory was that Ms. Bassett wasn't involved, that she was actually on her ranch during this crime. And so the fact that the boots match the mud at her park seems to be used to prove that case theory.
Okay. She's using words that you said in opening statement, counsel. Do you have a response?
Yes, Your Honor. We agree that it's our theory broadly that Miss Bassett wasn't involved in this crime. Of course, as the defense, that's sort of our obligation here, even though we're not raising an affirmative defense. However, it doesn't really matter to us whether that dirt on her boots came from her park, whether it came from working out on her front lawn, whether it came from any other swamp in Florida or elsewhere in the United States. What matters here, specifically with the line of questioning, is that the FBI was told by Carol Bassett a potential explanation, and frankly, they failed to look a little closer at it. They didn't investigate it. Again, a limiting instruction would be fine with us, but this is certainly relevant, not just for the truth of the matter asserted, which you can put aside, but for the effect it had on the FBI.
I will grant the limiting instruction. And Ms. Campbell, if he does use it substantively in closing, I fully expect to hear all about it during rebuttal.
Yes, Your Honor.
Carry on.
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Johnson, you asked Miss Bassett where the mud on her boots came from, right?
I did.
She said it probably came from working in the dirt at the Elephant Park.
Well, sir, first she said she didn't know, but she thought it was possible it came from the elephant park. You're right.
Right. She said, I don't know, probably from the elephant park. There's mud and dirt everywhere, right?
That's right, sir.
Agent Johnson, you collected dirt samples from entrances to the swamp, right?
You're right, sir.
You actually collected 3 dirt samples from 3 different entrances.
Yes, sir.
Over the course of this year-long investigation, you and your team, you never grabbed a shovel, went to the elephant park, and collected a sample of dirt from there and compared that to the dirt on Miss Bassett's boots, did you?
No, sir, we didn't.
You mentioned a little while ago that you think the murder weapon was a syringe from Miss Bassett's park, right?
That's exactly right. A syringe of this dangerous drug, carfentanil.
You know that Miss Bassett wasn't the only person who had access to the syringe.
That's true, sir. Ms. Bassett told me there were 4 people who had access. It was herself, and Mr. Clark himself, and then 2 other employees.
That's right. And there's no surveillance footage around the area where that drug is stored.
That's true.
You haven't recovered the missing syringe.
That's true, sir.
You haven't recovered Don Clark's body.
That's right.
So, ma'am, you can't tell us that you know for a fact that Don Clark was killed with that drug carfentanil.
My apologies. Just a point of order, Your Honor. I believe that opposing counsel actually cut the detective off before she completed her answer. I just asked that she be allowed to finish her answer before she's cut off.
I sort of got that sense too. Why don't we back up a question and let the witness answer the question you asked before?
Yes, Your Honor. My apologies. Ma'am, just to be clear, you haven't recovered the missing syringe, right?
That's right, sir.
You haven't recovered Don Clark's body.
That's right. I was saying that our team canvassed the Big Gum Swamp. That's a 33,000 acre swamp, but we were unable to recover the body.
You can't even tell us for a fact that that syringe is anywhere in Big Gum Swamp.
You're right, sir. We don't know what happened to that syringe.
Ma'am, you had a lot of information about Miss Bassett as you went through your investigation, right?
Of course. I mean, Ms. Bassett was the first person we made contact with in regards to this case, and we did end up arresting her in 2018.
You interviewed her multiple times.
Yes, sir.
You looked at her phone records.
Yes, sir.
You inspected the dirt on her boots.
That's right.
You actually thanked her for how cooperative she was.
Yes, sir. Actually, it was, again, it was Special Agent Garmo, but I was there for that conversation. You're right.
Agent Johnson, almost every witness you and your team talked to in this investigation cooperated with you.
That's true, sir.
There was only one witness who refused to be interviewed by the FBI, right?
You're right. That was Elisa Clark, Mr. Clark's former wife.
You'd recognize the victim's phone records if I showed them to you, right?
I'm sure.
Mr. Gondam, can you go ahead and put up Exhibit 21? And Your Honor, just for the record, Exhibit 21 is, of course, pre-admitted. And can we scroll to the phone records specifically, Mr. Gondam? Now, Agent Johnson, you think Don Clark died on the night of August 18th, right?
That's right, sir.
So that would mean the last call Don Clark received before he died, the last incoming call, that was from Lisa Clark.
Sir, that looks to be correct. It looks like he made 2 calls afterwards.
Right, but the last call he received was from Lisa Clark.
That's true.
Now, Lisa Clark wouldn't tell you what she said to the victim on that phone call.
That's right, sir. Like I said, Lisa Clark didn't cooperate with the FBI in our investigation.
But ma'am, you know that Lisa Clark has threatened Don Clark over the phone before, don't you?
Yes, sir. That's true.
Well, you didn't sample dirt from Lisa Clark's shoes to match it to the swamp.
No, sir, we didn't.
You didn't subpoena Lisa Clark's cell phone records.
No, sir, we didn't really have probable cause to look further into Miss Clark after all of this evidence came out implicating Miss Bassett.
Now, Agent Johnson, Lisa Clark, this woman who we know is threatening Don Clark, you have no idea where she was the night of August 18th, right?
That's true, sir. I know she lives in Orlando, but we don't know exactly where she was. We didn't hear from any witnesses that they saw anyone like her or named Lisa Clark.
What you know, ma'am, is when you asked Lisa Clark about Don Clark's disappearance, she said, quote, "That expletive deserved to die."
Yes, sir. That's true.
Thank you, ma'am. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you very much. Does the government have a redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
Sure. Go ahead.
Detective,
Well, why don't we wait for defense counsel to get back in his seat? Sorry.
My apologies, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, go ahead with the redirect. Thank you.
Detective, defense counsel just asked you a lot of questions about Lisa Clark. So I want to make something perfectly clear. Did Lisa Clark, or during your investigation, did you find that Lisa Clark had access to a deadly syringe that could kill Mr. Clark?
No, ma'am. Like I told you, the defendant told me there were only 4 people with access to that syringe. Lisa Clark was certainly not one of them.
Thank you, Detective. Your Honor, we have no further questions at this time.
I'm not sure if there's a recross allowed in this jurisdiction. Does the defense have one?
No recross, Your Honor.
All right, thank you very much. All right, Detective, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. With that, does the government have anything else? Ms. Campbell, I think you're on mute.
My apologies, Your Honor. We don't have any further witnesses. At this time, the government rests their case in chief.
Thank you very much. Do you two need 90 seconds, 2 minutes, or are you ready for your witness?
I'm ready, Your Honor.
Sounds good. All right, go ahead, defense. Call your witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Defense calls Joe Kwong to the stand. May I proceed, Your Honor?
Please, thank you.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, my name is Jo Kwong.
What do you do for a living, ma'am?
I'm a producer. I make documentaries and movies.
And I want to talk about how you're involved in this case. Do you know a woman named Cara Bassett?
I do. I've been working with Cara Bassett and her husband for about 5 years now. I was making a documentary on them called Elephant Queen.
How long have you known Miss Bassett?
For about 5 years, I worked on their property, recording them, doing whatever they would do every day.
Can you describe Miss Bassett to the jury for us?
Sure. She was super compassionate, and she was really passionate about her elephants. She absolutely loved them.
Did you know Miss Bassett's husband, Don Clark?
I did. He was also part of the documentary because he worked on the property with the elephants too.
Can you describe Mr. Clark to the jury?
Sure. Him and Cara had a really good relationship from what I saw. They worked together really well.
Over the years, you observed Cara and Don. Did you ever see Cara physically hurt Don?
No, I didn't.
Did you ever see Don hurt Cara?
No.
I want to talk about August 18th, 2017. Do you remember where you were that day?
Yeah, I was working on the property.
What time exactly were you at the park?
I usually got there around 8 o'clock, and then I would leave around 6 o'clock in the evening to get home.
And did you interact with Cara?
Of course.
Thinking back, ma'am, do you remember anything unusual about the way Cara was acting based on your experience?
No, it was pretty much like any other day. I would follow Cara around the park. She would take care of the elephants. I would get a lot of footage of the elephants too. Nothing was out of the ordinary.
Well, ma'am, did you see Don Clark that day?
I did. He was also on the property.
And do you remember the last time you talked to Don?
Yeah, I do.
What, if anything, did Mr. Clark say or do when you talked to him?
Well, it was around 6 p.m. that day. I was getting ready to head out, and I was talking to Don. And I was just telling him about my trip to Mexico. I was going to Mexico to gather some footage for a side project that I was working on. And then I started to notice that Don was getting a bit distracted when I was talking to him. And then I saw him look down on his phone, look back up at me, and his face turned completely white.
Ma'am, you said that you were getting ready to leave for a trip to Mexico. Did you end up taking that trip?
I did. I left that evening and got back on the 26th of August.
So when did you first find out that Don Clark was missing?
I found out he was missing when I got back.
Ma'am, when you got back, did you see the FBI investigating?
Oh, yeah. They were all over the property when I got back. I was just trying to film the documentary, but cops were everywhere.
Based on your observations, can you describe that investigation a little bit for us?
Objection, Your Honor. Question calls for an improper opinion. May I explain?
Please do.
Your Honor, we have it on a good faith basis that this witness is not an FBI expert. She's never worked with law enforcement, and therefore she can't really give any testimony about the quality of an FBI investigation. At this point, we believe defense counsel's question is asking her to discuss an investigation in an expert manner, which she cannot do.
Defense, could you remind me the wording of your question, please?
Yes, Your Honor. My question was, based on your observations, can you describe the FBI investigation for us?
Your Honor, if I may clarify,
Sure.
I think it would be a little bit different if defense counsel said, what did you see the FBI agents doing? What did you observe? But the question as phrased currently, what did you notice about the investigation, seems to delve outside of just a lay witness observations and go into some sort of expert testimony about how or about the quality of the FBI investigation.
Well, I agree with you that the witness probably cannot speak to the quality of the investigation. I don't think the question is calling for that. I think if she does go into that, then I think you have ample grounds to re-raise your objection, but for now it's overruled. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Kwong, I have some questions about that investigation based on what you saw. Did the FBI ever come up to you and ask you any questions?
Nope, not a single question.
Well, earlier you said you've been filming Kara and Mr. Clark since 2015. How much footage would you say that you have?
Oh, it has to be around like 2,000 hours of footage. I had a lot, and I was ready to put the documentary together.
Well, did the FBI ever ask to take a look at that footage?
No, they never asked to see it.
Did you see the FBI interview anyone else while you were watching them?
Not while I was watching them. I mean, there was just a couple of other park employees that would work at the same time as me, but I never saw them get interviewed by the FBI.
So what exactly did you see the FBI do then?
They were searching for stuff. I also saw them pick up some syringes and other types of evidence like that.
Oh, ma'am, this is very important. When you saw those police officers handling those syringes, were they wearing gloves?
No, they weren't. And I saw the lead person, Steph Johnson, reprimand those officers who weren't wearing gloves because of it.
Based on your experience with Kara Johnson, did you find that she was acting suspiciously when the FBI was investigating her?
You mean Kara Bassett, right?
Kara Bassett. Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
No, I didn't notice anything.
Ms. Kwong, I want to talk about a woman by the name of Lisa Clark. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, Lisa Clark was Don's ex-wife. I knew that because when I was working on the park, she would come by sometimes. I pretty much knew the ins and outs of both of their lives.
Can you describe the relationship you saw between Don Clark and Lisa Clark?
Yeah. Based on what I saw, it was pretty rough. And the reason that I say that is because the times that I would see Lisa come to the property, she would pretty much be screaming her head off at Don.
Did you ever notice those threats or screaming become specific?
I did. So there was this one time where she stormed onto the property, she's screaming at Don, and she tells Don that she's going to try and get him off the face of the earth and that he's going to be sorry.
Ma'am, are you familiar with...
My apologies. Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay, to the statements of Lisa Clark.
Okay, defense?
Your Honor, the statement, I think if I had paraphrased it, is, I'm going to try to wipe you off the face of the earth. That's a statement of plan, motive, or intent under 8033. As for the statement, you're going to be sorry, we're not using that to prove the truth of the matter asserted. It doesn't really matter to us whether the victim was in fact sorry. Again, this just goes towards the tone of the conversation. And the first statement is 8033.
Ms. Campbell.
Your Honor, with respect to the second statement, you're going to be sorry, or maybe I should start with the first statement. We'll concede that the first statement falls under 8033. But with respect to the second statement, you're going to be sorry, we're actually confused about what the defense is trying to say here. According to their opening statement and their cross-examination, it's very clear that they're trying to indicate that Lisa Clark might have been involved in this incident. And so her telling the victim that he's going to be sorry seems to need to be used to prove the truth of the matter asserted, that she had or wanted him to be sorry, that is, to inflict some sort of harm on him.
Defense, I'll give you one quick rebuttal.
Yeah, Your Honor, narrowly, the truth value of the statement, you're going to be sorry, is pretty minimal. And we don't care whether the victim went to his grave remorseless, whether he went to his grave unaware that he had done something to Lisa Clark. That's neither here nor there. It's just a threat. The actual truth value there is minimal, and we don't really care about it.
I'm going to give you one, and I'm going to take away the other. I'm going to sustain with respect to you're going to be sorry, and I will overrule with respect to the first statement. Go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor. Lisa Clark, you said that she wanted to wipe Don Clark off the face of the earth, ma'am. Are you familiar with documents showing the phone calls and text messages from Don Clark's phone in August 2017?
I am. I was shown them by the FBI.
So would you recognize them if I showed them to you?
Yes.
Mr. Gondam, can you go ahead and pull up Exhibit 21 and entered in evidence before trial? Can you see that, Ms. Kwong?
Yes, I can.
If I can direct your attention to line 6 in the text messages, can you zoom in on that for us? Who sent this message to Mr. Clark, ma'am?
Lisa Clark.
When is it sent?
It says 2:35 p.m. on August 18th.
What does it say?
Lisa said that she's tired of the lawyers and she wants to resolve it on her own, like adults.
Ma'am, you said that this was sent on August 18th. When was the last day that you saw Mr. Clark alive?
The last day that I saw Don Clark alive was that same day.
Thank you, ma'am. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Does the government have a cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Please, thank you.
I will take people to their graves if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants. Ms. Kwong, do those words sound familiar to you?
They do.
Ma'am, they sound familiar to you because those are the words of the defendant.
I interviewed her back in June of 2017, and in the interview, that's what she said.
Right, those are the words of the defendant?
Yes, ma'am.
And you said she said those words, that she was willing to send some people to their grave in June 2017.
Yes.
Ma'am, you know that that's just 2 months before her husband disappeared, right?
That's true.
I want to talk about why the defendant might have said she's willing to send people to their graves. Ma'am, based on your observations and your communications with the defendant, you knew she was really passionate about elephants, right?
Yeah, she loved elephants.
Sure, she told you over and over, year after year, she wanted to start an elephant sanctuary.
Yes, ma'am.
But ma'am, when you observe the observations between the defendant and her husband, you saw their husband, well, he didn't want to start that sanctuary.
I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that he said that eventually he would, but at the time, it wasn't like a sanctuary.
Let me be more clear. The defendant's husband told her that this wasn't a charity.
That's true.
The defendant's husband told her that their zoo was a business.
Yes.
And over the course of the time with you working with the defendant and her husband, he never took any steps to make that zoo what the defendant wanted, right?
That's what Miss Baskin thought.
Ma'am, you knew that this zoo issue caused a lot of arguments between the defendant and her husband, right?
Yeah, sure, I saw one of them.
Well, actually, you saw multiple times they were arguing and disagreeing with each other, right?
Yes.
But one specific time in summer of 2017, you remember the defendant got really angry with her husband, right?
Yeah, they got into an argument about the zoo.
They were arguing about the zoo and the defendant got really angry.
She did. She ended up throwing a vase when she was angry.
Hold on, Ms. Kwong, let's actually break that down for the members of the jury one by one. So the defendant and her husband are arguing over the animal sanctuary, yes?
Yes.
The defendant picks up a vase.
Yes.
And then she throws it at her husband's head. That's what you saw.
That's what I saw, but she did miss.
Ma'am, you saw the defendant throw a vase at her husband's head just a few months before he went missing.
That's true.
So let's talk about how he went missing. Ms. Kwong, you know that Mr. Clark went missing on August 18th, 2017, right?
Yes.
But you know that there were some things that were sort of weird surrounding Mr. Clark's disappearance. We can agree to that?
Sure.
Objection, Your Honor. An improper opinion as to whether a disappearance or its characteristics are weird.
Your Honor, if I may, I'm just
Go
asking
ahead.
the witness to testify about her personal understanding, whether she believed it was weird or not. If she didn't, she can say it wasn't. And I believe what the witness actually said on the stand just now is that she did think it was sort of weird.
I'll overrule it. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor.
So Ms. Kwong, I want to talk about why Mr. Clark's disappearance seems so weird to you. First of all, you know that, when the night that the night that Mr. Clark disappeared, you actually saw his GPS records, right?
Not the night that he disappeared.
Excuse me, Ms. Kwong, let me be more specific. You saw the GPS records that were taken from the night that Mr. Clark disappeared, right?
Yes, I did.
You actually see those on your screen right now.
Yes.
Ma'am, according to these records, Mr. Clark's car went to a swamp 130 miles from his home. True?
That's what it looks like.
Ma'am, you knew Mr. Clark pretty well.
I would say so.
You had been working with him for a number of years.
Yep, about 5.
Had a number of conversations with him.
Yes, I did.
Ma'am, nothing that Mr. Clark said in all of your years talking to him made you think he had any reason to go to a swamp in the middle of the night, right?
I have no idea.
You have no reason to think that he would be connected or be wanting to go to a swamp, right?
I honestly do not know.
Okay, let's talk about something else that was sort of weird about Mr. Clark's disappearance. Ma'am, around the time Mr. Clark disappeared, you know that the defendant had deadly elephant tranquilizers in her zoo, right?
Yes, there were tranquilizers.
These were deadly, true?
They are.
And you know that the defendant knew how to use those deadly tranquilizers around the time her husband went missing?
I'm sure they're just syringes.
Well, you actually saw her use them before, right? Well, fair enough. You actually saw the defendant use those syringes before, right?
Yes, I have.
Now, you also knew that these syringes, well, they weren't open to the public, right?
No, just a couple people had access to them. It was her and Dawn and a couple of employees.
Right, so these syringes were actually kept in a shed on the zoo.
Yes, they were.
That shed was locked.
It was.
You needed a key to get inside.
You did.
The defendant had a key, didn't she?
Yes.
Ma'am, I want to talk about something else that was weird regarding Mr. Clark's disappearance. Ma'am, you remember looking at the phone records from the defendant around the time that her husband disappeared, right?
Yes, I did.
Let's take a look at those phone records. Ma'am, you know that the night the defendant's husband disappeared, she didn't try to call her husband, did she?
It doesn't look like it, no.
She didn't try to call her husband's family, as far as you can tell in this document.
Objection, Your Honor. I'd object to improper opinion, specifically to the question tried to call. May I be heard?
Sure.
My understanding is a summary of telephone calls just lists successful incoming and outgoing calls. It doesn't list any calls that were attempted to be made, for example, but couldn't go through because of a lack of wireless connection. So the wording of that question, the defendant didn't try to call certain people. That goes well beyond this witness's scope of knowledge. Frankly, well beyond even the investigator's scope of knowledge.
Your Honor, we're happy to rephrase.
I was just about to ask you to do that. Thank you.
Yes,
Sustain.
Your Honor.
So Ms. Kwong, according to this document, she never called her husband's family when he went missing.
But it doesn't look like it.
According to this document, she didn't call her husband's friends when he went missing.
I'm not sure unless they work at Super Soups. It doesn't look like it.
Ma'am, you see here that the defendant called the police on August 25th, 2017, right?
Yes.
The defendant didn't call the police until a full week after her husband went missing. Is that what this document shows?
That is.
Let's talk about what the defendant did do when her husband went missing. 3 months after Don Clark disappeared, the defendant changed the elephant zoo into an elephant sanctuary, right?
Yes.
It was only after her husband disappeared that the defendant was able to take control of those elephants.
I would say that she already had control over the elephants before he disappeared.
Let me be more specific. It was only after the defendant's husband disappeared that she had full control over those elephants, full ownership, let me say.
I guess so.
And it was only after the defendant's husband disappeared that she was able to start running the elephant sanctuary the way that she wanted.
Yes, she had been wanting to run it like a sanctuary for years.
And she only did that after her husband disappeared, yes?
Yes, that's when it became a sanctuary.
Thank you, Ms. Kwong. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you very much. Is there a redirect?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. You may be excused. Appreciate your time. With that, we are now right before closing arguments. Are there any housekeeping matters before we go any farther?
None from the government, Your Honor.
Sure.
And none from the defense.
Great. Why don't we take 90 seconds to 3 minutes for both of you to get a drink of water, take a few breathers. And for everyone else, we're now going to hear closing arguments from each party. Everyone, please switch back to speaker view. Again, that's in the top right of your screen. And for the scoring judges, since the witnesses have completed their testimony and since our advocates are going to be taking just a minute or two for a break, you can go ahead and do the scoring portion of your ballot for the witnesses. All right, and advocates, I'll check back in with you in just a couple minutes, okay? Thanks. You both ready to go?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Great. All right. Scoring judges, I hope y'all are in speaker view, and I'm excited for some closing arguments. Government, proceed whenever you are ready.
May it please the court. For a year after her husband went missing, the defendant had it all. She got to wake up every morning and see millions of dollars in her bank account. Her husband didn't get to wake up at all. She got to wake up and pick out which of the 7 cars that she inherited that she wanted to drive. Her husband got to die in a car. And she got to run this beautiful elephant sanctuary that she had been trying to control for years, while her husband is dead and gone forever. But what you learned in trial today is that the defendant didn't get this life because she earned it. She didn't get to live this life by chance. The defendant got this life because she took it. Because in order to take what her husband had, the defendant had to take her husband's life. That's why, as the government in today's trial, we brought charges against the defendant for murdering her husband. That means we proved to you, beyond all reasonable doubt, that the defendant killed her husband and that she did so intentionally. Well, let's talk about how. First of all, members of the jury, you know that the defendant had a reason to kill her husband. We talked to you about this document that the defendant signed just 2 months before her husband went missing, this power of attorney document. And when you go back to deliberate, you'll be able to read this full document. According to this document, the defendant got everything. She got money, she got cars, she got real estate, she got access, she got the zoo that she has been trying to get for years. All she had to do was make sure her husband went missing. And so there's your motive. Just because the defendant had a reason to kill her husband, it doesn't mean she actually did. How do we know that she really followed through with it? Well, members of the jury, look at the physical evidence. Detective Johnson took the stand today and told you all about algae that was found on the defendant's boots. Algae that matched perfectly where we know the victim's body ended up the night that he disappeared. Algae that demonstrates not only that the defendant went to that swamp, but that the defendant lied about it. Not only do we have the algae, ladies and gentlemen, but we have the syringes. We know that the defendant kept deadly elephant syringes in her sanctuary. We know those syringes were in a shed with a door, with a lock, and we know the defendant had the key. On top of that, Detective Johnson told you that, well, the night that her husband disappeared, one of those syringes went missing. The defense tried to say, well, we don't know what happened to the syringe. It could be anywhere. It could be anyone. But members of the jury, it couldn't be anyone. It couldn't be anywhere because only one person who had the motive to do this had access to those syringes: the defendant. So how can we be so certain that the defendant did this? I'm sure defense counsel is going to get up here and say, well, the physical evidence, it might not tie, maybe it doesn't work. So how can we be sure that she actually was involved in her husband's murder? Members of the jury, take a look at her suspicious behavior. You got an opportunity to look at the defendant's call logs from the whole week after her husband disappeared. And those call logs didn't indicate an innocent and grieving wife. They didn't indicate someone who was worried about their husband being gone. She didn't call her husband. She didn't call her husband's family. She didn't call her husband's friends. She didn't even call the police for an entire week. Members of the jury, that is not the behavior of a grieving wife. Maybe she didn't call him to figure out where he was because she knew where he was. Because she knew that in order to take what he had, she had to take his life. Defense counsel comes up here and says, well, just look a little closer. He tells you if you look real close at the evidence, you're going to find that it points to somebody else. You're going to find that it points to Lisa Clark. And his big point as to how Lisa Clark was involved in this case is that she called her husband, or excuse me, she called her ex-husband the same day that he went missing. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't die from a phone call. You die because someone puts an elephant syringe into your body. Lisa Clark didn't have access to that syringe, the defendant did. Your body doesn't just disappear because of a phone call. Your body disappears if someone throws it into a swamp. Lisa Clark, or there's no evidence that Lisa Clark ever went to that swamp, but there's evidence that the defendant did. And you don't just die because of a phone call doesn't demonstrate that someone has the motive to kill. But we know for certain that the defendant had that motive. Facts, members of the jury. They're stubborn things. They can't be changed. They can't be avoided. And there's one fact in this case that's so stubborn that nothing defense counsel says can change it. In order to get what he had, the defendant had to take his life. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you for your closing argument. Defense, I'm sure you've got one too.
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead whenever you're ready. Thank you.
May it please the court, members of the jury, look a little closer. Ms. Campbell just got up here and she told you the evidence against Kara Bassett is irrefutable, that she took her husband's life to get his property, that the forensics, the GPS data, the money, her relationship, the motive, they all point to murder. But you know better, because today you've gotten a chance to look a little closer, a chance to dig a little deeper into what the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office have been doing for the last 2.5 years. And when you look a little closer, you see an investigation that's painfully incomplete. One that ignored a key suspect, one that jumped to conclusions and assumed the worst of an innocent woman. That's what happens when you don't look a little closer. Members of the jury, it's important to remember that when Ms. Bassett walked into this courtroom today, she was presumed innocent. That doesn't change unless the state proves otherwise. See, that's the big difference between the FBI's investigation and this trial. Because when Agent Johnson and the FBI refused to look a little closer, there was no one there to hold them accountable. No one asking them tough questions, no one pointing at missing evidence, no one reminding them that they had to assume Ms. Bassett wasn't a murderer before they started pinning a crime on her. That's how we got here. But now Ms. Bassett has a presumption of innocence, and the government has the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest burden in the legal system. And that's where the FBI's mistakes caught up to them, because the government could not and did not meet that burden today. And members of the jury, that's clear when we look a little closer at the FBI's investigation and the evidence they tried to use to point a finger at Ms. Bassett. See, first they brought you this data from Mr. Clark's van GPS. They showed it to you and told you it proves Ms. Bassett killed her husband because she drove from the sanctuary to a swamp. She stayed there for 45 minutes and then drove back to an airport 5 miles from her house. Members of the jury, I want you to look a little closer at the document in the deliberation room. All it shows is that the car was driven to and from those locations. It tells us how long it took. It doesn't say who drove the car. It doesn't say who drove it back. The GPS doesn't prove anything at all because Mr. Clark's body wasn't even found at the swamp. The FBI never found it at all. So all that data tells us is someone drove to and from a swamp. And then the government said, well, maybe the GPS data doesn't tell us who was in the van, but the forensic evidence does. Forensic evidence that proves it was Ms. Bassett who got in the car to dump her husband's body in a swamp. They showed you a forensics report and they said there's algae and mud on the boots, algae and mud in the car, algae and mud in the swamp. It had to match. Members of the jury, look a little closer at that report. You'll see that the FBI worked hard to collect samples from the swamp. They collected 3. But they never did the same at Ms. Bassett's park, where she said her boots got muddy. because the FBI didn't follow that explanation, because they didn't compare that to the mud, because they didn't look any closer when they found the answer they wanted. That is reasonable doubt. Another critical question, members of the jury, that the government had to answer was, how was Don Clark killed? And this, again, is where they jumped to a conclusion that would support the theory they wanted, not the one that the evidence supports. Because they told you, yes, there was a missing syringe with deadly elephant tranquilizers. They told you Miss Bassett must have used that syringe to kill her husband. That's what their case has been about, access to that syringe. But that's exactly the kind of logical leap the government can't make, because Cara Bassett is presumed innocent. They can't look at a box of syringes 4 people had access to, find one missing, then without a toxicology report, without an autopsy, without an eyewitness say, Cara Bassett took it out and she used it to kill her husband. When they told you the syringe was the murder weapon, that was a guess. Members of the jury, you have to look a little closer. You have to see those missing links, because that's reasonable doubt. And they've talked a lot about Miss Bassett's relationship with her husband. That's the reason she killed him, to get what he owned. But today you met Jo Kwong, and she told you what that relationship was really like. Cara Bassett and Don Clark were a normal couple, with ups and downs and fights, but they loved each other. And more importantly, Ms. Kwong told you about another relationship, a relationship that never came up in Ms. Campbell's opening statement, came up once in her closing argument. Mr. Clark with his ex-wife, Lisa. Look a little closer at that. Because everything you learned about Lisa Clark was something the FBI could have learned if they didn't ignore it. You learned today that Lisa Clark threatened to wipe Don off the face of the earth, that she was the last person to call Don Clark before he died. Members of the jury, why couldn't she be the killer? Why couldn't she meet Don Clark at that swamp? We have some unanswered questions about Lisa Clark, members of the jury. Where was she on August 18th? What did she say when she called Don Clark? What does her cell data tell us? Does she have a weapon? Does she have a criminal record? The government didn't bother to follow up. They asked her to interview. She said no, thank you, and the FBI gave up. Members of the jury, that's latching onto a theory to make the fill in the blanks work for you. That's human error. It's understandable. But in a trial like this, members of the jury, it's unacceptable. Ms. Campbell told you something powerful today. Facts are a stubborn thing. And when you look a little closer, they just don't add up for the government. Find Cara Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have a rebuttal?
And I believe we actually don't have time for one.
Okay. All right. With that, advocates, thank you very much. Judges, please fill out your ballots right now. And Ms. Shepard, our bailiff, I think you're going to let me know once those are all submitted. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
Thank you, Audrey. All right, so advocates, sit tight. We're just going to fill out our ballots for a minute. If you need to get up, stretch your legs, do whatever you got to do, go ahead.
Hi, Courtroom A. We are waiting for a couple more ballots before you can move on to comments. And we'll also go ahead and have you stop the recording, bailiff, please, because we don't